What if I told you that in 1179, an 8-year-old girl was legally sold into marriage to a teenage emperor? That this child would later be forced to marry a 65-year-old man when she was just 11? That her story would end in such horror that even medieval chroniclers struggled to record what happened? This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Agnes of France, and what happened to her reveals one of history's darkest truths about how children were treated by the powerful. If you enjoy stories like this, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps a small channel like mine. Now, back to the story. Agnes was born into the French royal court in 1171, the daughter of King Louis VII and his third wife, Adela of Champagne. While most children her age were learning basic letters, Agnes was already being groomed for political usefulness. She spent her days in the palace gardens of Paris, playing with wooden dolls and chasing butterflies through the corridors. Her tutors described her as exceptionally bright. She could read Latin by age 6 and had memorized entire passages of religious texts. But Agnes's childhood was never meant to last. In 1179, when Agnes was just 8 years old, her father received an urgent message from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was in crisis. The young Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, barely 13 years old himself, was under the control of his regents and faced threats from all directions. Armies pressed at his borders while internal rebellions threatened to tear his empire apart. The empire needed a powerful ally, and alliances required marriage bonds. Louis VII saw an opportunity. The Byzantine Empire still controlled the richest trade routes in the Mediterranean. An alliance could make France the dominant power in Christian Europe. The negotiations were swift and brutal in their efficiency. Agnes wasn't consulted, she wasn't even told what was being discussed. While she played with her dolls in the palace nursery, men in distant rooms were deciding her fate. The marriage contract was signed in 1179. Agnes of France, age 8, would become the wife of Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, age 13. When Agnes was finally told, she asked the question that would haunt everyone, "But when will I come back home?" The silence that followed gave her the answer she couldn't yet understand. Her nurses tried to explain it as an adventure, a chance to become an empress and wear beautiful crowns. But Agnes had seen enough court marriages to know that wives didn't come home for visits. She had watched her older sisters disappear into marriages, their letters becoming less frequent until they stopped entirely. The preparations began immediately. Agnes was measured for traveling clothes and taught basic Greek phrases. Court seamstresses worked day and night creating a wardrobe fit for an empress, gowns that would fit a woman, not a child. When Agnes tried them on, the fabric pulled around her tiny frame like colorful tents. But the most disturbing preparation was the conversations. Palace ladies began speaking to Agnes about wifely duties and pleasing her husband. They used euphemisms a 7-year-old couldn't understand, but Agnes sensed the adults' discomfort. Something about these lessons made the grown women look away when they spoke. As spring turned to summer, Agnes's world shrank to lessons and preparations. Her dolls were packed away. Empresses don't play with toys. Her favorite foods were replaced with Byzantine delicacies she hated. Even her hair was changed, braided in the complex styles of Constantinople rather than the simple French fashion she preferred. The final blow came when Agnes was told she couldn't bring her favorite nurse, Marie, on the journey. Marie had been with Agnes since birth, the closest thing to a mother she'd known. But the Byzantine court had sent word, Agnes would have Greek servants now. French influences were to be minimized. On the night before her departure, Agnes was found in the palace chapel, praying to return home soon. She had no idea she would never see France again. The transaction was complete. An 8-year-old child had been sold to secure an empire's future, and no one, not her father, not the young emperor's regents, not the church that would bless the marriage, saw anything wrong with it. But what Agnes didn't know was that her marriage to a teenage emperor would be just the beginning of her nightmare. The real horror was yet to come, and it would involve a man old enough to be her grandfather. But Agnes wasn't just a political pawn. She was a human being, and what happened to her next would shock even the cynical world of medieval politics. In September of 1179, 8-year-old Agnes of France began the longest journey of her short life. The route from Paris to Constantinople stretched over 2,000 miles through territories controlled by hostile powers. Medieval travel was dangerous enough for armed knights; for a child, it was potentially deadly. Agnes's escort consisted of 30 French nobles, 50 knights, and a small army of servants. But the most important member of her party was someone she'd never met, Maria of Anjou, a Byzantine noblewoman sent specifically to prepare Agnes for her new life. Maria spoke fluent Greek and French, and her job was to transform a French princess into a Byzantine empress during the 3-month journey. The first shock came at the Italian border. Agnes discovered that everything French about her was now considered wrong. Her clothes, her food, even the way she held her hands while walking, all of it had to change. Maria began each day with lessons in Greek court protocol, teaching Agnes how to bow in the specific Byzantine manner, how to speak only when spoken to, and how to keep her eyes lowered in the presence of men. But the most disturbing lessons involved what Maria called imperial expectations. She explained to Agnes that Byzantine empresses had different duties from French princesses. They were expected to produce heirs quickly, to manage vast harems of servants, and to participate in court ceremonies that Agnes couldn't yet understand. When Agnes asked what these ceremonies involved, Maria's answers were vague and uncomfortable. The physical journey was brutal. Agnes, accustomed to the comfortable palaces of France, now slept in military camps and ate preserved foods that made her stomach ache. She developed a persistent cough that lasted for weeks, but the party couldn't stop. Every day of delay meant more risk from bandits and rival political factions. As they crossed into Byzantine territory, Agnes saw her first glimpse of her new world. The cities were unlike anything in France: massive stone walls, towering domes, and markets filled with merchants speaking languages she'd never heard. The people stared at her procession with curiosity, but Agnes noticed something else in their faces: pity. The final approach to Constantinople took 3 days. Agnes could see the city's massive walls and gleaming domes from miles away, but nothing prepared her for the reality of the imperial capital. Constantinople was home to nearly 500,000 people, making it the largest city in the Christian world. The noise, the smells, the sheer overwhelming scale of it all terrified a child who had never seen anything larger than a French market town. When Agnes first laid eyes on the Great Palace, she asked Maria a question that revealed her complete innocence: "Is that where we'll visit the Emperor?" Maria's face went pale as she realized Agnes still didn't understand that this would be her permanent home. The imperial reception was designed to intimidate. Agnes was led through corridors lined with guards wearing armor she'd never seen before. The walls were covered with mosaics depicting Byzantine military victories, and the floors were made of marble so polished that Agnes could see her reflection. Every step echoed through the vast spaces, reminding her of how small she was in this enormous world. But the most shocking moment came when Agnes finally met Emperor Alexios II Komnenos. Despite being only 13 years old, he was already scarred by the brutal politics of Byzantine court life. His mother had been murdered when he was 11, and he'd been forced to watch his father's advisors execute anyone they considered a threat. The boy who was supposed to be Agnes's husband was barely older than her, but his eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had already seen too much death. Their first meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Alexios barely looked at Agnes, speaking only in formal Greek phrases that she couldn't understand. When Maria translated, Agnes learned that the emperor had said she was suitable for imperial purposes, not exactly the romantic greeting an 8-year-old might have expected. The real power behind the throne was Alexios's regent, Andronikos Komnenos, the emperor's elderly uncle. At 65 years old, Andronikos had spent decades fighting wars and eliminating rivals. When he looked at Agnes, she later told her servants, she felt like prey being studied by a predator. Agnes was assigned quarters in the women's section of the palace, where she would live until the wedding ceremony. The rooms were luxurious beyond anything she'd known in France, but they were also a prison. She couldn't leave without permission, couldn't speak to anyone without a translator, and couldn't even eat familiar foods. The Byzantine court ladies assigned to serve Agnes were kind but distant. They spoke about her as if she weren't there, discussing her physical development and speculating about when she would be ready for marriage. Agnes understood enough Greek by now to know they were talking about her body, but she couldn't understand why adults were so interested in whether she had started developing like a woman. The wedding preparations began immediately. Agnes was fitted for the elaborate imperial wedding dress, a garment so heavy with gold thread and jewels that she could barely stand while wearing it. The ceremony would take place in the Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent church in the Christian world, but Agnes felt only dread about the approaching date. What Agnes didn't know was that her marriage to young Alexios would be the least of her problems. The real danger was coming from someone much older, much more powerful, and much more ruthless than a teenage emperor. The Byzantine court was about to show Agnes exactly how disposable children were in the game of imperial politics. And for an 8-year-old girl thousands of miles from home, there would be nowhere to run. The wedding of Agnes of France and Emperor Alexios II took place on March 2, 1180, in the Hagia Sophia. Agnes was 8 years old. The ceremony itself was a spectacle designed to demonstrate Byzantine power, but for the child bride, it was pure terror. Byzantine wedding rituals were unlike anything Agnes had experienced. The ceremony began at dawn with a crowning, where heavy golden crowns were placed on both the bride's and the groom's heads. Agnes's crown was so large it kept slipping down over her eyes, requiring constant adjustment by the priests. The ritual dance that followed, where the couple was supposed to circle the altar 3 times, became a humiliating struggle as Agnes stumbled under the weight of her ceremonial robes. But the most disturbing aspect was the public nature of the consummation expectations. Byzantine law required that the marriage be witnessed to ensure legitimacy, meaning court officials would escort the couple to the imperial bedchamber and wait outside until the marriage was confirmed. For Agnes, who still played with dolls just months earlier, the significance of this ritual was both confusing and terrifying. What happened that night reveals the complicated reality of child marriage in the medieval world. Alexios II, despite being only 13, was already aware of the political implications of his actions. Court physicians had examined Agnes and declared her not yet ready for full marital relations. The consummation was delayed, officially for religious reasons, but actually because even medieval society recognized some limits. Agnes spent her first weeks as empress in a state of confusion. She was given adult responsibilities she couldn't understand. Managing household staff, approving ceremonial protocols, and attending court functions where she was expected to remain silent and still for hours. Palace tutors taught her imperial etiquette, but they also began preparing her for eventual motherhood, lessons that an 8-year-old couldn't comprehend. The relationship between Agnes and Alexios was more like frightened siblings than husband and wife. Both were children trapped in adult roles, surrounded by adults who saw them as political tools rather than human beings. Alexios, dealing with his trauma from his mother's murder, was often distant and preoccupied with survival. Agnes, isolated by language and culture, spent most of her time with Byzantine court ladies who treated her like a valuable but fragile possession. But the real danger wasn't coming from her teenage husband. It was coming from his uncle, Andronikos Komnenos, who had been watching Agnes with increasing interest since her arrival. Andronikos had spent decades accumulating power behind the throne. At 65, he was a veteran of Byzantine court intrigue, having survived multiple assassination attempts and eliminated countless rivals. He had been waiting for the right moment to seize complete control of the empire, and Agnes's marriage to Alexios had given him that opportunity. The plan was simple and brutal. Andronikos would eliminate the young emperor and claim the throne himself. But he needed legitimacy, and in Byzantine politics, legitimacy came through marriage to the previous emperor's widow. It didn't matter that Agnes was 8 years old and Alexios was 13. What mattered was that she would become the legal pathway to imperial power. In September of 1183, just 3 years after Agnes's wedding, Andronikos made his move. Emperor Alexios II was murdered in his sleep, officially by unknown assassins, but everyone in the court knew who was responsible. The boy who had been Agnes's husband was strangled with a bowstring, a common method of assassination in Byzantine politics. Agnes, now 11 years old, found herself a widow and completely alone in a foreign empire. She had no family, no allies, and no understanding of what was about to happen to her. Within days of Alexios's death, Andronikos announced his intention to marry the former empress to ensure the stability of the empire. The age difference was staggering. Agnes was 11, and Andronikos was 65. But in medieval politics, the age of consent was whatever the law said it was, and Byzantine law said that Agnes was legally available for marriage. The fact that she was a child didn't matter. The fact that she was already traumatized by her first marriage didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she represented legitimacy to the throne. Agnes's reaction to this announcement was recorded by Byzantine chroniclers, who noted that she wept continuously and refused to eat for days. But her grief and terror were irrelevant. The wedding was scheduled for December 1183, giving her just 3 months to prepare for marriage to a man old enough to be her grandfather. What's heart-wrenching about the historical record is how casually the chroniclers discussed this arrangement. They wrote about it as if it were a normal political transaction, barely acknowledging that they were describing the systematic abuse of a child. This wasn't seen as a tragedy, it was seen as Tuesday in the Byzantine Empire. The real tragedy is that Agnes had no choice, no voice, and no escape. She was trapped in a system that valued political stability over human dignity, and she was about to learn that her nightmare was only beginning. The second wedding of Agnes of France took place in December 1183. She was 11 years old. Her new husband, Andronikos I Komnenos, was 65. The age gap was 54 years. Unlike her first wedding, this ceremony was deliberately private. Andronikos understood that even Byzantine society had limits, and the public spectacle of an elderly emperor marrying a child might provoke unrest. Only essential court officials attended, and the chroniclers who recorded the event noted the unseemly haste with which it was conducted. Agnes's physical deterioration began immediately. Palace physicians recorded that she stopped eating regularly, lost significant weight, and developed what they called melancholic episodes, periods where she would stare blankly at walls for hours without speaking. Modern psychologists would recognize these symptoms as a severe trauma response, but medieval medicine had no framework for understanding psychological damage. The Empress's daily routine became a carefully monitored prison. Andronikos assigned eunuch guards to watch Agnes constantly, officially for her protection but actually to prevent any escape attempts. She was moved to isolated chambers in the palace where her every movement was controlled. Letters to or from France were intercepted and destroyed. Agnes had become a ghost in her imperial palace. But the most disturbing aspect of her new marriage was Andronikos's treatment of her as both wife and political symbol. He paraded her at court functions to demonstrate his legitimacy, forcing her to stand beside him while he conducted state business. Agnes, barely tall enough to reach his shoulder, would remain motionless for hours while Andronikos made decisions that affected millions of people. The physical relationship between them was documented in disturbing detail by palace servants. Agnes frequently appeared with bruises that she claimed came from falling down stairs. She developed a chronic cough that never seemed to heal, and her hair began falling out in patches, symptoms that suggested extreme stress and possible malnutrition. More troubling were the behavioral changes. Agnes began speaking to invisible people, having conversations with what she claimed were French angels who would take her home. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, crying for her father or her childhood nurse, Marie. The palace staff noted that she often seemed confused about where she was or what year it was. Andronikos's reaction to his wife's psychological breakdown was purely practical. He consulted with physicians not about her mental health, but about her ability to produce heirs. When told that Agnes's physical condition made pregnancy unlikely, he began making contingency plans for additional marriages. At 65, he was already considering which other young women might serve as backup options. The political pressure only made Agnes's situation worse. Andronikos's reign was increasingly unstable, with rebellions breaking out across the empire. He needed a male heir to secure his legacy, and Agnes's failure to conceive was seen as a personal and political failure. Court officials began whispering that perhaps the Empress was defective or cursed. Agnes's attempts to cope with her situation became increasingly desperate. She started refusing to attend court functions, claiming illness. When forced to appear, she would sometimes faint or vomit in public. Palace records show that she requested permission to enter a convent multiple times, but these requests were always denied. The breaking point came in early 1185. Agnes, now 12 years old, made her most desperate escape attempt. She tried to flee the palace disguised as a servant, hoping to reach the French embassy in Constantinople. She was caught within hours, but the attempt revealed how completely her spirit had been broken. According to the guards who found her, Agnes was found crying in a church, begging God to let her die like her first husband. Andronikos's response was swift and brutal. Agnes was confined to her chambers under constant guard, with her food tested for poison and her visitors restricted to approved palace staff. She was told that any further escape attempts would result in punishment for the servants who had helped her, effectively making her a prisoner of her conscience. The final months of Agnes's life were spent in almost complete isolation. She was brought out only for the most essential court ceremonies, appearing increasingly frail and detached from reality. Contemporary accounts describe her as more ghost than empress, moving through the palace like a shadow of the child she had once been. What makes Agnes's story particularly heartbreaking is how normal it appeared to everyone around her. The chroniclers who recorded these events wrote about them as routine political developments, barely acknowledging that they were documenting the systematic destruction of a child's mind and body. This wasn't seen as abuse, it was seen as the cost of empire. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing aspect of all. The final weeks of Agnes's life were marked by increasingly erratic behavior from her husband. Andronikos I Komnenos was facing multiple rebellions across the empire, and his grip on power was slipping. He had become paranoid, executing perceived enemies daily and seeing conspiracies everywhere. Agnes, as his most visible political asset, became the target of his growing desperation. Palace records from August 1185 show that Agnes was moved to a heavily guarded section of the palace reserved for political prisoners. This wasn't presented as punishment officially, it was for her protection during the political upheaval. But the guards assigned to watch her were the same ones typically used for enemies of the state. The symptoms of Agnes's final illness were documented by palace physicians, and they paint a disturbing picture. She experienced severe stomach pains, vomiting, and what the doctors called black bile, symptoms consistent with poisoning. But she also showed signs of complete psychological collapse, speaking only in French and seeming to forget where she was. What makes her death particularly suspicious is the timing. Agnes died just 3 days before a major rebellion reached Constantinople. Andronikos was already planning his escape from the city, and a living wife who could be used against him by his enemies was a liability he couldn't afford. The funeral was conducted with minimal ceremony. Unlike other imperial deaths, there was no public mourning period, no elaborate tomb, and no official proclamation of grief. Agnes was buried in an unmarked grave in the palace grounds, and within weeks, it was as if she had never existed. Andronikos himself died just 2 months later, torn apart by an angry mob when the final rebellion reached Constantinople. His death was public, brutal, and celebrated by the people he had oppressed. The man who had destroyed a child's life met his end in the streets, but by then, Agnes was already forgotten. The historical record of Agnes's life was deliberately obscured. Most chroniclers barely mentioned her existence, treating her as a footnote in the story of Byzantine politics. The few who did record her story focused on the political implications of her marriages rather than her suffering. But some details survived. A French chronicler, writing decades later, noted that Agnes's death brought great sorrow to the court of France, suggesting that news of her fate eventually reached her homeland. Her father, Louis VII, had died 2 years earlier, never knowing what had happened to the daughter he had sold for political advantage. The most tragic aspect of Agnes's story is how easily she was erased from history. She left no children, no lasting political impact, and no monuments to her memory. The girl who had been used as a pawn in imperial politics was discarded just as casually when she was no longer useful. Her story survives today only because a few chroniclers bothered to record the basic facts, the ages at her marriages, the dates of key events, and the circumstances of her death. They wrote about her as if she were a political commodity rather than a human being, which, in their world, she essentially was. Agnes of France represents thousands of children throughout history who were sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. Her story is particularly well documented, but she wasn't unique. Medieval courts across Europe routinely used children as bargaining chips, and most of their stories are lost forever. What's tragic is how little has changed in some parts of the world. According to UNICEF, approximately 12 million girls are married before their 18th birthday every year, often to men decades older than themselves. Agnes's story from the 12th century echoes in the 21st century, reminding us that the abuse of children in the name of politics, tradition, or power is not just a historical curiosity, it's an ongoing tragedy. The girl who played with dolls in the gardens of Paris, who asked when she could come home, who died alone in a foreign palace at 13, she deserved better. They all do. Thank you for staying with me through this heartbreaking and difficult but important story. Agnes's life was brief and tragic, but remembering her means she's not completely forgotten. History isn't always comfortable, but it teaches us that the powerful have always been willing to sacrifice the innocent for their ambitions. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize them when they happen today. Until next time. Stay curious, and remember that every historical statistic was once a real person with hopes, fears, and dreams.